And I would like to first start before all other things with inviting our elder from Curve Lake, Lorenzo Mita, to come and start us in a good way.
I was gonna have a smudge for you when I was calling on the way in. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all here, and I want to be thankful for your presence. I want to be thankful for your the way you receive things, and the way you give back. I also would like to be thankful that I have a house for my family. And I know people who don't. I want to be thankful for the nice weather we've had so long. For those people without housing, that their life wouldn't be so tumultuous. And I pray, Creator, pray that you come and join us here tonight as Amadou. Scan our way up within as Amadou. Please help us with the work we have before us, Creator. I would like to be thankful for the ability to be here this late in the day. Because there are people that can't make it here. They just don't have it in them. I'd like to be thankful, Creator, for the opportunity to speak here. Because I see each opportunity as a time to contribute to what's going on in the world around me, around us. I'd like to be thankful, Creator, for all that I have, all that we have. Creator, I ask you once again to come here and help us. Help us be kind and respectful to one another. And help us to honor those who are offering knowledge to us. So at this time, Creator, at this time, I'm going to go and sit down, Creator, to join us, be here, and follow us home tonight. So when we get back to our loved ones, they are much in the same health as when we left them, if not better. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Lorenzo, for those words and for starting us off. I want to also acknowledge that I'm not originally from this territory. I said in my introduction, I said I'm from Mino-Bimmaadiziwn, so Sarnia, Chippewas of Sarnia in English, and Petoskey in English, which is northern Michigan. Originally it was Benossigi, and they changed us to Polish. I've been fortunate enough to be welcomed into this community, this Mississauga or Michigan community by the people here. I have traditional family and kinship family here now. I've had the privilege of raising my son here, working here and enjoying life here. And I'm really, really, really grateful to the people of this territory for that. And my work with Peterborough Health Unit, as well as every place else in this community, is my responsibility as a visitor here to make sure that I'm doing my part to acknowledge this beautiful place. So Miigwech for that. A lot of people will say it's the Williams Treaty territory, and I like to remind people that there's more than 18 agreements and treaties that were signed in this territory. The Williams Treaty is one treaty, actually a handful of them, but it's not all that there is. And you need to learn about the people here. You need to ask them about this territory and be thankful for it. So Miigwech for that. At this time, I would like to invite Dr. Thomas, okay, he lives in called Thomas, up for a few words. Dr.
Hi, my name's Thomas, and I am a settler here in Mino-Bimmaadiziwn and the Medical Officer of Health CEO of the Health Unit, Peterborough Public Health. Really wonderful to see a couple of our board members, including our board of health chair, here this evening, and thank you to them for coming, and for all of you here in person and online. And I'm largely here to listen this evening and very much looking forward to that. And we have really incredible list of individuals and other resources, people with significant knowledge here in the community, and I look forward to the discussion tonight. I'll just share a few thoughts from my perspective as a medical officer of health on housing and homelessness, and in particular Indigenous health, which is disproportionately impacted by these challenges, these issues. I know as a doctor that shelter, housing is one of our most critical, most basic needs. Human beings can survive 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, but in bad climate can't even survive 3 hours without shelter. And so shelter is our most basic need. And as we see and look around us, shelter is increasingly a concern and is therefore not just a health issue, but a key human issue. And we know that as our social safety net is inadequate to meet basic needs such as housing and food, the impacts on people's health is worsening. In this community in Peterborough, housing costs, the median cost of a house has quadrupled in the last decade, nearly quadrupled in the past decade. The number of people entering homelessness has outpaced the number of people exiting homelessness. Homelessness is an extreme end of a continuum where many people may meet inadequate housing needs. And the health outcomes are not only for those that we visibly see experiencing homelessness, but with many people who may be living in crowded or inadequate living conditions. We know this includes infectious diseases. I started my public health career as a medical officer of health in Labrador in the north, and certainly in the north, significant challenges with overcrowding led to concerns around COVID-19, but also around other infections such as tuberculosis, which itself is a social disease from the impacts of inadequate housing. There are many other health impacts of inadequate housing, including mental health challenges, cognitive impairments, injuries, chronic diseases, and ultimately the impact of homelessness on health is significant, with a life expectancy of somebody who's experienced homelessness nearly half what a Canadian average is. And so the best estimate for males is a life expectancy of 42 compared to 80 as an average life expectancy in Canada, and for females 52 compared to 84. We know through COVID-19 there's a disproportionate burden of homelessness on people experiencing homelessness. 20 times higher rate of hospitalization, 5 times higher rate of death. The roots of homelessness are deep and complex. It has its roots in an unfair society and adversity that's often faced earliest in life, in the first couple of years even adult. The evidence shows over 90% of people experiencing homelessness have personally experienced a traumatic event such as violence, abuse, neglect, parental substance use, parental incarceration. When a child has these cards stacked against them, the consequences are clear and impacts them potentially through their life. I had the tremendous privilege of being part of the Canadian guidelines on homelessness and health. And in that work, there was a separate a tangential process that was undertaken, led by Jesse Thistle and Janet Smiley on housing and Indigenous health. And that report talks about the fact that Indigenous peoples are 8 times more likely to be homeless than non-Indigenous peoples, and represent anywhere from 10 to 80% of the population experiencing homelessness in larger urban centers. They talk about the roots of Indigenous homelessness linking directly to colonial disruptions of self, family, community, land, water, place, animals, culture, language. And so it is not therefore surprising that in this community, in our very own community, the point in time count that United Way did to assess homelessness identified that 27% of those experiencing homelessness right here in our community in Peterborough self-report Indigenous identity. And this is an overrepresentation by nearly sevenfold. The point in time count has demonstrated this challenge in our community is getting worse, and that there is significant social and health needs of population. And so I just wanted to share a few perspectives from a health perspective generally. I recognize I bring a Western medical perspective to the work that I do, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation here this evening. Very much looking forward to hearing from the panelists and our board chair here. Grateful that you're able to run the show here tonight, Liz, as our chair of the Indigenous Health Advisory Circle of Peterborough Public Health, which is a tremendously important work, and grateful always for your work. For David, your work as vice chair and helping to lead the idea that brought together this session this evening. So I want to say a big Chimiwaj. I want to say Nakumek. I want to say thank you. And again, looking forward to the discussion.
So just a couple more words before we get started. And so as Thomas mentioned, I'm the current chair, newest chair, thanks David, of the Indigenous Advisory Committee, or Indigenous part of the Indigenous governance at Peterborough Public Health. But we're lucky to have Katie here with us, who's the previous chair. And sorry, I would like to ask you to come up and say a couple words, because the work that's happening now, and as I come in as the chair, has been started and maintained and supported by yourself and First Nations.
Viwech, Liz for the introduction. Wabshashi Dodem, Wigoskwe, Indishnikos, Anishinaabe, and Gao, Hiawatha, and Dotwa. My name is Katie, or Catherine Wilson. I am from the Martin clan. My Indigenous name is Birch Barkwoman, and I am a citizen of Hiawatha. Current 5th term on council, 2nd term as chair for Peterborough Public Health. I apparently am a yes person. Very grateful to be here. Very important topic, very important for political, because we do strive to advocate for our citizens who live off territory. Our funding won't allow us to assist them with housing off territory, which is a problem since we did not create reservations. They did. They created the separation, and so it is an ongoing battle. Housing, speaking with Thomas earlier about housing on territory and the issues that we have in regards to funding, in regards to land, and that we have to buy it back piece by piece in order to be able to have enough space for our citizens who have the ability to return home. Should they be able to afford to build a house, because of course the funding they do provide does not increase with the economy of scale for any purpose at all. I'm very fortunate. I was adopted at birth and raised in Peterborough in Mino-Bimmaadiziwn, and I was very lucky that 2 years ago I was able to build and return home to my community. I know that's not something that is available for all, which is why we're here and doing the work that we're doing and advocating for all of our people, urban and on territory. So that should be
So tonight is our inaugural event talking about issues that are important to Indigenous communities in Peterborough and the Peterborough region. It's the brainchild of David, my vice chair, and then we all talked about it, worked on it, and pulled together our network of people that we know and that are doing amazing work across the province and across the country, basically. Because for Indigenous people, and when we're talking about the social determinants of health, when it comes to Anishinaabe people, it just says Aboriginal people. And so this is our opportunity to talk about the things that are the social determinants of health for Indigenous people or Anishinaabe in the broadest sense of the term. So we welcome you and being here, whether it's in person or virtually, and for those people that are going to be watching after, because this is being recorded, and a lot of times people do watch after the fact of the live event. I'm going to explain a little bit how it's going to go. We have 4 people. Is Candace online? Oh, yes, let's see. So we have 4 people that are here going to be presenting tonight. They come from all different areas. They have done work that is very diverse from each other, as well as for the common cause. Again, different areas, but in the Indigenous community, when we're doing something in the broadest sense of the word, it affects all of us. It benefits all of us. It makes ripples right across the communities. It does not take away from our sovereignty and what we need in our own individual communities, but it does help us all together. So we're not the same. There isn't a pan approach. And this is our attempts at doing that. So we welcome you here to this. Each panelist will speak for 15 to 20 minutes. I'll give you a subtle late when you're getting close. And then there will be opportunity for questions afterwards, whether they're from in person or online. And I have prepared a few questions myself to ask the panelists as well. So how we figured, or how I figured, it's my fault if somebody doesn't like it, we would do the presentations as by geographical, who's coming from the farthest direction right until we get here to our home base. So I would like to introduce Kevin Fitzmaurice as well as Candace. Sorry, I'm looking for my notes here.
Candace Martin.
Candace Martin, my apologies. Both based in Sudbury, and they've been doing a ton of work in the homelessness and housing for Indigenous people and research, as well as the Urban Knowledge Network, UA, Urban Aboriginal Knowledge Network. I printed everything off so I would have it at my disposal, and now it's all mixed up. My apologies.
That's okay. I can do my own intro if you want.
Perfect.
Easy peasy, right?
Hold on, we'll turn yet.
Okay, so hello, bonjour, aniwache. My name is Candace Martin. I'm OG Cree from Hornpain First Nations, which is actually being renamed First Nations of Morrison River and Nagagamassis. And I'm enfranchised into Fort Albany First Nations. So personally, I am a third-year medical student at Queen's University and a single mom of a 15-year-old son and a veteran of the Canadian Special Forces. Sorry, he's 16. He just corrected me. Teenagers, right? So I'm also working on a two-eyed seeing approach to medicine, where we bring local Indigenous people into the medical schools to teach future physicians about our strengths and challenges, to try and reduce stigmatization and tokenization. So I've learned many things that I would like to share with you today. Many things you may know, many things you may not. I'm also the Vice President of the Native People of Sudbury Development Corporation on their Board of Directors. So that's why I'm here to give a little bit of that perspective. So I'd first like to give you some context as to why I'm so passionate about housing and insecurity as an Indigenous person. We learn about health determinants in school in a matter-of-fact way, where they say as Indigenous people, you are more at risk for diabetes, mental health issues, home insecurity, but they don't consider why when these are being discussed. With mass displacement into secluded areas made for challenging living conditions, it depends on the area, because you may not have farming, hunting, fishing, gathering, or even healthy food sources readily available. That results in diabetes running rampant. The lack of intergenerational wealth also leads to financial insecurity, even if there is food imported into the communities. Also, intergenerational trauma from from the traumatization of the 60 scoop generation, residential schools, and day school survivors resulted in continuous suffering, because it's not just them, it's their kids, kids. And so now we have more mental health issues directly as a result of the way the government treated our people. Most reserves don't have access to physicians regularly and may have to leave their community for care, only when it's deemed urgent enough to warrant an evacuation in some cases. Services options differ drastically depending on where you're from, whether you're in the city or you're in a secluded reserve. You may have to leave your community just to get blood work or x-rays or cancer treatments even, and then be forced to go back the very next day, which is not ideal medical treatment. While some might have access in town, because of the experimentation that has happened to Indigenous people in the past, there's a huge distrust in the system in place for the medical system as well as the government. So you'll see people waiting until last minute or until it's too late to make any easily remediable interventions. So people come to the hospital late and they come to the hospital worse. And I've seen this firsthand. So when they do get out of their community, they tend to be vulnerable for care and for accommodations, as those are just what is provided by the medical associations or the social services that are available to them. Often with no credit cards or emergency funds, they only have the cash that their band gives them or the services that are being offered at the time, which means if they miss their flight, they'll be stranded. And if they dispute with the hotel owners that they're being set up in, they're left homeless. And if they don't like the food that they're provided, then they just starve. All while being there for medical services for themselves or a close family member, because that's the only reason why they would evacuate you on their dime. That's hard. That's very hard. There are many gaps in the system with dysfunction between who is responsible for the Indigenous medical care, whether it's coming from the federal government or the provincial government. There's issues with that, but often that results to housing insecurity when they come out, because they may not be able to go back to where they come from. Our Indigenous people suffer from lack of housing greater than any other population for many reasons. Health inequities are often veiled as health determinants instead of the side effects of colonialism and systemic racism. So we need to do better. And funding services like geared to income housing can not only save healthcare millions more than the actual supplements cost, but the cost incurred to the hospital is usually from unnecessary visits because people are just simply housing insecure. So they have nowhere else to go. So they come to the hospital and we're not going to kick them out, but they're having a bad day for various reasons. And there's nowhere else to go with all the shelters full and all the housing being lists for years on end. Housing aid would provide a safe environment for people to grow past the trauma that they have experienced. And as the Vice President of Native People of Sudbury Development Corporation, I am very much proud of the work that is being done by these types of communities, by these types of organizations to help our Indigenous people have somewhere to live. Because we're not starting from zero like everybody else. We're starting from like -10 when we're trying to play this game of life. So not only are you fighting the intergenerational trauma, you're fighting the access to food, but so is everybody else in your family. So if you do happen to be doing well, you still have to worry about your brothers, your sisters, your cousins, your moms, your uncles, your aunt, because as a community, we tend to be close and care about our family and worry about them on a very deep level. So it's really hard to get ahead when you're being held back by so many levels. So I wanted to bring up that conversation. I know it's really heavy, and I'm sorry we started off so heavy, but it is a very important topic that I'm passionate about, and I hope that it has been informative to everybody, at least a little bit of something you might not have known. If you have any questions about my two-eyed seeing approach to medicine project that I'm working on, I'm bringing local Indigenous people into the medical schools to try and give the opinions of the local communities so that the future physicians will know what we're going through so that they can be better. So I wanted to let you guys know about that, but also I really hope there's more funding options for housing later. Thank you. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Kevin, you take 3 minutes to introduce yourself too.
Okay. So I'll introduce myself formally. So I was just going to say I do have a PowerPoint. I'm not sure where, but I'll introduce myself formally first. And so Ani, Bojo, Kevin Fitzmaurice, Indigenous, and Swakamak, Nogojigwanang, and Dojaba, Jaganash, Inuiji, Mitsimama, Anishinaabe, Nini, and Dao. And so what I've said is I've introduced myself as Kevin Fitzmaurice. I've said that I'm living both in Swakamak, Sudbury, as well as Nogojigwanang, Peterborough. I've also introduced myself as a non-Indigenous person that walks with the Anishinaabe as an allied scholar. The reason I'm between places is I was, okay, I won't introduce myself too much. I am a graduate of the Indigenous Studies Master's and Doctoral Program here at Trent, and I spent the last 18 years up at Laurentian University of Sudbury in the Indigenous Studies program as a faculty member and chair at different times. And I've recently come back to Trent, and I'm in the process of transitioning. And so I want to thank everyone for inviting me here today. And I was asked to share some of the work that we've been doing in Sudbury, but also more broadly as well. And so I've focused this talk a little bit on, well, maybe I can actually get to the talk, and I have some slides. Yeah.
Let's do another slide deck first.
I emailed it before that. That's about an hour before. So.
Oh,
yeah. So it should be in the email.
Oh, okay. I just think I just need a moment to get them up because, okay.
Sure.
Is this Sarah's login?
I'm not really sure. Do you send them to?
Probably you. Was it on your email?
Sorry.
My email.
Do you have it, David?
Let's see. Sent to, sorry, Elizabeth.
That's me.
Do you want to send it to
Can
me?
you forward it to Lena?
For it?
Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah, mine.
You could just send it again.
Do you want to send it?
Send it again. Sure.
Please, yeah.
Who do I?
So my email is g.held out
Okay.
at pcch
SGIL.
at
SG.
Yeah.
Okay.
pcchu
PCCHU.
dot c.
FCA.
So I'll tap dance for a couple of minutes. One of the things that's really neat about this coming together is that I have had contact with each of these individuals, whether it's from afar or in person. And so a lot of these people here I've known for a number of years. Kevin, it's been about 20 years. Steve, it's been a lot of years. 30, almost 30 years. And Gamamonik, since I'm about 13 or 14 years. And so for me, it's really beautiful to see the work that's happening and continuing to happen. Because working with Indigenous community, in Indigenous community, is tough work. It's hard work. And what we're talking about here is Mino-Bimmaadiziwn, and how home contributes and is totally necessary for Mino-Bimmaadiziwn. So is taking care of ourselves, that holistic care. And so for me, it fills my heart to identify that these people, I've known them for so many years, and I've known that because I've been through some pretty heavy things with all of them. And so it brings my heart joy to say that they not only know and have learned about, they've actually lived and contributed to their own healthy lives and healthy community to be able to continue to contribute and make a difference with Anishinaabe people and again, in the broadest sense of the word. So I'm blessed to share that and blessed to say that, we've been through some crazy times together over the years with everybody. So thank you for coming and thank you for accepting the SEMA to speak and to share. And look at that. Good to go.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. And just make sure that it's working.
Are we in the way?
Nope.
No.
That's not, nope. I think so.
Where do I
No, you have to stay there.
I'll just use the
Yeah,
computer. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Okay. Okay, so the title of my talk is Fostering Mino-Bimmaadiziwn Housing, Home, and Health. And David asked me to come and talk about current research, just to highlight current research in this area. And I also want to particularly mention much of this work comes. I've been on the board of Native People of Sudbury Housing, and which is the urban Indigenous housing provider in Sudbury, of which there's 114 urban Indigenous housing providers across the country, and it's part of the Urban Native Housing Program, originally run out of CMHC, but is increasingly being terminated. And so I'm going to talk about that program. And some of the recent impacts of the termination of that program, those experiences on the board of Native People of Sudbury Housing have deeply informed the work that I've been doing, working with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, Francophone and Anglophone people in northeastern Ontario on housing and homelessness issues, and so. So here's the talk. It'll be 20 minutes. It starts with a safe and affordable place to call home, Indigenous homelessness, urban Indigenous research in housing and homelessness, the urban Native housing program, and then making the shift. And so the first two slides I just wanted to talk about are coming out of the beginning of a national study of which I'm a co-PI. And what the intention of that study is to evaluate. So it's funded by SSHRC and the CMHC, and the intention is to evaluate the affordable housing, the National Housing Strategy Act. And we've just begun that work, and we've just convened, and we held a specific Indigenous housing and homelessness focus of the first conference. And here are some of the points that were brought forth. And the reason I'm including this, I think it well reflects the literature, the existing literature presently out there. And so the first is there is a range of overrepresentation, but on average, we're seeing alarming overrepresentation of Indigenous people in homelessness communities and homelessness populations with diverse experiences, including cultural homelessness. And it's often complex, intersecting needs relating to, and we've talked about this already, and I know this is, Candace spoke to it, and I have a feeling, Steve, and Karen, you're going to speak to this. Intergenerational trauma and the long assault of settler colonialism experienced by Indigenous people, relating to the residential schools, as well as overrepresentation in child welfare, the justice system, and a structured, systemic anti-Indigenous racism, poverty, and violence. And so David has done a lot of work on the long assault of colonialism, or particularly settler colonialism in Canada. And we see the direct impacts of that contributing to the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in homelessness populations. So that's the start, right? That's the start. And what's required are supportive, holistic responses that relate to the whole person. So the body, the mind, and the spirit. Where urban Indigenous homelessness connects to oppressive living conditions in Indigenous communities outside as well. So there's a connection to Indigenous communities outside of the cities. My work in particular, and our work in particular, has tended to focus on the urban Indigenous community over the last 10, 15 years. Some other important points that came up at the initial gathering was that CMHC funding of Indigenous nonprofits and the possibility of urban reserves, so that connection of First Nations communities specifically for housing First Nations members as an expression of Indigenous rights in the city, came out as a pretty complex conversation, actually. And the need for non-Indigenous allies in this effort, and the importance of a diversity of knowledge perspectives, including lived experiences, to break down the silos or the online echo chambers. And the acknowledgement that reconciliation is hard work, and the movement to ongoing relationship building in the direction of living well and enjoying the world together. And recognizing diversity within Indigenous communities, and the need for this to be reflected in the questions and the data collected. And so a part of that work was the beginning of the conversation of what research projects could look like as part of this evaluative work of the National Housing Strategy Act. And the work coming out of, and the ideas coming out of, in Swakimut, particularly Native People of Sudbury Development Corp, and I'm going to talk about it today, is the termination of the Urban Native Housing Program. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the details of that. And what is so alarming is that in the middle of a housing crisis, and a long-standing housing crisis in Canada, and with the alarming overrepresentation of Indigenous people in homelessness populations, the structure, the various policies and laws that are in place in providing and supporting the Urban Native Housing Program are actually leading to the termination of that program itself. And so it's part of the work that we want to do as part of this evaluative study. I just wanted to include this because I think at this point now, the social determinants of health, my understanding, was kind of new about 15 years ago, where we began to understand health and more in the larger social context. And as part of that, that growing awareness and understanding is growing literature on the ongoing assault of settler colonialism as a social indicator of Indigenous health. And now we're talking about it as, yes, we all completely understand that, but that wasn't always the case, right? And so in the literature as well, we see Indigenous health disparities and inequities despite socioeconomic improvements for some Indigenous people. And in the literature, we see a broad range of measures of disparities and inequities. But what I feel like, there's some work coming out of Toronto with Smiley and Jesse Bissell, but there really needs to be much more targeted data on these realities, is what I can tell. And what I wanted just to start off with the first few slides is some of the work and some of the data also generated over the last 10 to 15 years in urban Indigenous studies. And David and myself have been involved in a number of those studies listed on the top. And I just wanted to highlight, and it's kind of like setting the table, like setting the context for the conversation. And so we know now that the majority of Indigenous people are living in cities, that there are gains in employment and education and income, and an emerging minority of economically successful community members, and that there are urban Indigenous communities which are young, culturally diverse, highly mobile, and home to an increasing number of newcomers. We've seen over the last 10 years incredible growth rates, actually, of the urban Indigenous population, and some of our work focused in on Ontario, particularly Toronto, Ottawa, and Sudbury. That's where I first met Stephen. We did a case study on NamiRes as part of the Toronto Aboriginal Research Project. This was a really important finding from the Urban Aboriginal People Study, which was a national study, which David was part of. And a really important finding was that the city is considered to be home to the majority of urban Indigenous people, with some familial, ceremonial links to First Nations communities or communities of origin. And where home ownership is an increasing reality for urban Indigenous people. So it's really important in our work that we also highlight strengths, right? And that we acknowledge the complexity and diversity within Indigenous communities. And it's really important to recognize Indigenous home ownership in urban centers as part of urban Indigenous communities. And so increasingly, there's experience of transitioning out of poverty, and urban native housing services and urban social services or rent geared to income services like the Urban Indigenous Housing Program, and into home ownership. And so it's really, really important to acknowledge the growth, and I will talk about this as well, the growth of urban Indigenous social service organizations and the incredible work that they're doing. And the incredible success that they're also having, and that these Indigenous specific social services are working. They're working to lift people out of experiences with poverty and homelessness. And so we see an organizational development and governance. We see an invisible infrastructure of social service network, the growth of urban Indigenous self-government and governance within cities and councils. And there's a newly created in the last 2 years, a National Urban Indigenous Council. And we see the expression and exercise of urban Indigenous rights as constitutional rights. And so that's really, really important. And nonetheless, we also see, and this is, I think, in many cases why we're here tonight, is the persistence of overrepresentation in poverty and homelessness, child welfare, and criminal justice. And that adequate and affordable housing is a major challenge for urban Indigenous people because of high incidence of poverty, unemployment, single-parent families, and racism within the housing sector. So where we see unstable or poor housing is connected to many other factors influencing the quality of life. And that housing that integrates a diversity of community and culturally based supports is what's required. So the next few slides tell a story of need, of unmet need. And there's a number of studies that I'm referring to here that talk about the extent of that need, the extent of that unmet need in terms of affordable housing for urban Indigenous community members. And so, and the need, this particular one from the National Housing Association, their action plan spoke to the need for 3,000 dwellings annually. So new housing development, a combination of new construction and acquisition, the need to preserve and improve existing stock, as well as the need for 1,000 new transitional and supportive housing spaces with ongoing support services. And I want to just highlight that point because we're in the middle of working with youth in Northeastern Ontario, Indigenous, non-Francophone, and Anglophone, and we're halfway through that study. And we already clearly see the need for transitional residential shelter for Indigenous youth to help transition these community members to Native people of Sudbury housing as a rent geared to income housing service. Right now, that doesn't exist. And so some of the findings that I'm going to be talking about are that the youth that are receiving services, homelessness specific harm prevention services in Sudbury, Timmins, and Cochrane are not able, those services don't provide the tools for them to actually emerge out of homelessness and their experience into social housing. And so they're very much stuck in these cycles of homelessness. And so I will talk about that a little bit more. Okay. And this is what I want to focus on here. And this is the detail of the termination of the Urban Native Housing Program, is that the mortgages are becoming due. The mortgages are being paid off. And so the agreements with the organizations like Native People of Sudbury Housing and CMHC are being terminated because now you own your home. And the subsidy for urban Native housing providers is based on the agreement. So without the agreement, there's no longer a relationship with the federal government, and there's no longer a subsidy. And the result of that is that rents then, in order to break even, rents need to be raised. And so we move, as an agency, we move from rent geared to income to below market rent is what we're looking at. And so, and here is our story. And I'm going to go because I'm just in the interest of time, because I want to highlight key points, but I want to go to the case study for Native People of Sudbury Housing, because this is unique to Sudbury or Swakopmund, but similar experiences are happening across the country in terms of urban Native housing providers in cities across the country. Remembering that there's 114 of them. And so in Sudbury, we have 1975 approximately, and there was a few years around that, we had 106 units, and 96 in Sudbury, 11 in Espanola, and all part of and funded out by CMHC under the Urban Native Housing Program that offered safe, affordable, and quality homes right across the city. And they were purchased and built in 6 phases. And so the idea is to counteract racism and to build community and culturally supportive Indigenous housing as an expression both of Indigenous rights in the city and Indigenous governance in the city. And as a contributing part of the larger institutional development in cities across the country, and contributing to the growth of urban Indigenous communities as well. Mm-hmm. And so at this, and most recently, we've had, there's a significant unmet need where our waiting list, and this is current as well, our waiting list is approximately 3 years. Our waiting list. So, and this is where Indigenous people are significantly overrepresented in homelessness population. So approximately 9% of Sudbury population self-identifies as Indigenous and make up 42% of the homelessness population. In the Making of the Shift study that I'm involved in, presently it's 55% of youth experiencing homelessness in Sudbury, Timmins, and Cochrane self-identify as Indigenous. And so what our first experience with the termination of our operating agreements was that we had to raise the rent, and we displaced the tenants of those units. And so as an urban Native housing provider, we then contributed to their precarity and the possibility of their homelessness. And so I think as an organization, I think it's fair to say that we panicked. And and then all of our remaining mortgages and all of our agreements were terminated in 2020. And what happened is we advocated politically. We worked really hard to raise awareness about this. I spoke about it wherever I went. We all did, right? At conferences, at political forums. And then the city stepped up. The city stepped up and offered temporary relief for us to maintain our subsidies and maintain our operating practices as community and culturally based. However, and this is not to blame them, because they needed to operate within their own context of policy and law, and what that is the Ontario Housing Services Act. They attempted to slot us into the Ontario Housing Services Act as a social housing provider, not an Indigenous social housing provider. The word Indigenous doesn't presently exist right now in the Ontario Housing Services Act. And so we fought them. And we're still in a legal battle with them to be able to practice, to do our work in a way that we're accustomed to and in a way that won't in any way harm our tenants. And so this is an ongoing struggle that we're having, and it's now taken the form. So the city stepped up, and then the federal government stepped up in terms of the Canada-Ontario Community Housing Initiative called COCHU, so that we could maintain our subsidies, social supports, and our prior operating practices as an urban Indigenous housing provider. However, the legal disputes are continuing. Because presently the city does not have an Indigenous urban housing provider legal context to work from. And so we keep having these disagreements and lawyers keep getting involved. And so far we keep getting our way. You know, that's where it is now. And so we talk about that as colonization through devolution of the relationship of funding from federal government to the city through the Ontario Housing Services Act. And so there is a risk of a loss of the rent geared to income Indigenous housing in the middle of a housing crisis. That risk continues because that funding is now year to year. We no longer have an agreement, we have a year to year arrangement. Am I running out of time? How many? Okay. The other project that we're working on is called Making the Shift. And it's a national study to end youth homelessness in Canada through prevention measures. And so I think what I want to do here is I want to go right to the end of this. I'll close now on this on 3 points. And we just finished a year-end report. And one of the questions of the report was, what are 3 things that you would like policy makers to know about this work, coming out of this work? I will say this is a community-based research project. We have 20 community agency partners in the Sudbury, Timmins, and Cochrane. We're interviewing 120 youth over a 3-year period. So we're interviewing them 4 times, initial and then follow-ups. So it's a longitudinal study. It's Indigenous, non-Francophone, Anglophone. And the 3 things, those are community partners. Those are our range of definitions of homelessness. These are some of the findings. But the 3 things that I would like you to know, or I would like policy makers to know, is that youth who are experiencing homelessness in our community are doing so through no fault of their own. These 3 paragraphs come directly from our preliminary reporting and findings. Through no fault of their own. Many are leaving broken homes at a young age, have a disability, or they are aging out of institutional care and do not have the necessary support such as housing, food, transportation, and care that all youth need to attend and succeed at school, work, and to live a good life. We have collectively allowed our governments to turn their backs on youth in need in our community. There are presently no services for youth that are experiencing homelessness in Sudbury, Timmins, and Cochrane, which can help provide the basic life supports to lift them out of homelessness. We go around with outreach workers, our research team, and they get socks, granola bars. They're invited to a meal, right? They have to find their sanitation. They have to find out. There's nothing available in our communities that can actually help transition, right? Transition out. The services that are available attempt to meet very basic needs of food, water, and shelter and function to maintain their homelessness. And just lastly, youth who are experiencing homelessness in Sudbury, Timmins, or Cochrane are working hard to find housing and exit homelessness, but they are caught in a daily struggle to meet their basic needs. Over time, they are becoming increasingly worn down, sick, and many are feeling overwhelming shame, despair, and homelessness. Many youth experiencing homelessness in our communities are dying. We've had 5 of our research participants die within the last year and a half. I've never been involved in a research project where this has happened with our participants, right? And as adults, and I really feel strongly about this, well, obviously I do, as adults in our community, we are neglecting our youth when they need us most. We need to get involved and do so much more. And so the last thing I'll say is we worked on the building of that shelter, which is the key recommendation. And we ran into all kinds of incredible roadblocks. And we were meeting regularly with CMHC to do it. And it's presently stalled. But that's a clear need coming out of this work, and we'll continue to keep working on it. Yeah. Anyway, you go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Candace, for talking about the important work that you're doing in the Sudbury area and region, because it is happening across the province and across the northern part of Turtle Island. Next, we're going to have Steve Teekins talk, and Steve is the executive director of Mino-Bimmaadiziwn residence in Toronto and has been for a number of years. And the work that he does is priceless and totally needed in Toronto. And it has, although it says Native Men's Residence, the scope of the work that happens there is way beyond just a residence. And some of you may have been to the powwow that happens every year in the city that tries to raise money for the work that happens there. And the work that they do as well is integral to maintaining health within the Indigenous community, whether it's through the COVID-19 pandemic, or with mental health and addictions, or housing, or the criminal justice system, or any of those things. So thank you, Steve, for coming, and we look forward to hear what you have to say.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. It's nice to be here in Peterborough. I have to say, in my drive-in, whenever I go to different places, I drive around and check the place out, and I was disappointed to see the tent city up the road. I didn't think that was here. And I was disappointed to see the people that were homeless, downtown area. I thought that it was much better here than it is. I'm disappointed and shocked. It's coming from Toronto, you see homelessness all over the place. So Nami-Res has been around for 40 years. We just celebrated our 40-year anniversary this year. And initially started as a service that operated temporary emergency shelter for men who needed a place to stay. Over the years, we've really grown leaps and bounds. And I'm going to talk about housing, but I'm also going to talk about our public health response that emerged during COVID. And I'll try to tie it all in 20 minutes. So, yeah, it works. Okay. So this is the first housing project we did in Toronto. We did this project in 2010. It's 2 houses, and it's 22 units of housing. It's in Parkdale. And when we did this construction, we finished it on time and on budget. Imagine that. And, we did get a lot of practice and experience doing construction and doing these big builds and working with architects and so on through renovating the 2 existing shelters that we have. And both of our shelters, we renovated them. They were done on time and on budget. And one shelter was done under budget. And what we did with the surplus is we have permission with the funders to put solar panels on our roof to sell the electricity back to the grid. That sounded like a great idea at the time, but our calculations for selling the electricity back to the grid weren't quite as what we thought. But it was innovative. So anyways, right now at NAMI Res, we operate a number of affordable housing. So the definition in Ontario of affordable housing is 80% of what market rent is. So let's use some round numbers here. So if rent in Peterborough was $1,000 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment, which I don't think it is, okay, didn't think so, then it would be affordable if it was $800 a month. Do you think some of the folks experiencing homelessness outside could afford $800 a month if that was a price? No, heck no. So affordable housing truly isn't affordable by the provincial government's definition. What we offer is deeply affordable housing. So this picture of these 2 Victorian-style homes in Parkdale that you see here, we purchased both of them at the time in 2010, and we renovated both of them. I believe that just because someone experienced homelessness doesn't mean they need to live in crappy housing. These are beautiful houses. We looked at a number of innovations in terms of offering that housing. We looked at, we explored geothermal as a way to heat and cool the place, but it just wasn't there and it was very costly at the time. So we didn't go that way, but we went with Energy Star rated appliances. We went with double or triple pane glass windows. We looked at ways to save energy. We did spray foam when it first came out. It was new at the time to make sure that it had a high R rating for insulation, so we weren't leaking out energy or emissions. And we know working with men that they're hard on things, so we had to make sure the house was durable, that the shower fixtures were strong, that the showers wouldn't leak. Well, they leak once in a while, but we tried. We notice when you invest on the front end in housing materials that are durable and meant to last, they'll last a long time. So you won't always be spending money or trying to find money somewhere to fix things constantly. So we thought on the front end investment, that was a good way to do things. Now, since then in Toronto, we've acquired another house, which I'll talk about shortly. But right now, as we speak, we have 3 more affordable housing projects in different stages of the works. We have one on Coxwell at 20 units. We purchased it in the middle of the pandemic with our own funds. And we just passed committee of adjustment in June. So that's 2.5 years from purchasing, paying a mortgage for a vacant lot property to getting the building permit. 2.5 years. Not many not-for-profits can afford that. We're lucky. I don't want to waste money on paying a mortgage for a place sitting empty, but that's kind of what we did. We haven't started construction yet. And then just recently we applied to CMHC for their not co-investment, the rapid housing. And we lost out by 1 point. So all our capital funding we were hoping for, gone. So for a few weeks I was at square one wondering what the heck are we going to do with this property? Are we going to flip it and sell it? Are we going to keep it and somehow make it work? Well, our friends at the Affordable Housing Office at the City of Toronto, they were able to come up with some funds for us, so it's fully funded now. We also have another building on Carlton Avenue. It's going to be 11 units, and it's going to be completed at the end of March. And it's going to be, again, deeply affordable housing for our guys. And with this one, it's an interesting one because we had to compete against Indigenous and non-Indigenous housing providers to win that opportunity to operate it. What we got was a 50-year lease to operate that housing and the ability to more or less own it, but without owning it, right? Sort of like on the res, I guess, eh? No? Except ours is for 50 years. Yeah. So then we have another one that I just signed the deal last week to finalize the sale. And we bought a beautiful old Victorian-style home on Broadview Avenue in Riverdale area. And our idea with that one, that's going to be 12 units of deeply affordable housing for our guys. I think when you're an Indigenous housing provider, it's good to have different housing projects in the works at different times if you can swing it. And we're able to do that. And then on top of that, we have a new shelter in the works in Toronto, and it's going to be a 70-bed shelter. So I've hit a lot of barriers in Toronto to getting affordable housing, and this is just a few that I've listed. It takes a long time to acquire permits in Toronto. The permit system in Toronto is broken. It has been for quite a long time, and it really urgently needs to be fixed. I know they talk a lot about it, and I haven't really seen it happen yet, but it's a big problem. Building code variances usually trigger a committee of adjustment hearing. So for instance, say we triggered a lot of building code variances with our first housing project I showed you. And it was old building code that when that house was built going up against new building code. And sometimes things had to be grandfathered if we could. We'd have to ask the committee of adjustment to be able to do that. If our neighbors were unsatisfied with the natives moving in the neighborhood, which all of our neighbors were with every housing project we've ever had, that they can go to these committee of adjustments and complain. And if they're successful in their complaints, they can tie up our building process with an appeal. And usually the appeals process after committee of adjustment, you have to go to the Toronto TLAB, Toronto Board of Appeal or something like that. And usually it takes them about a year to make a decision. Luckily, we haven't had to go there yet. But when you have to do committee of adjustment, it triggers a statutory community consultation. And I've been through all kinds of them, and they're harmful, they're ugly, and I don't really like them. As an Indigenous housing provider, we always encounter racism from our neighbors every single time. It's really ridiculous and harmful. And I can't believe the audacity of people that will say things right to your face in a panel forum like this. It's really ridiculous. And then we have some really wise people too that will put in public record their racist views in letters to the appeals board. And I have great examples of that, which I could have shared, but I chose not to. And then recently with our new shelter in St. Lawrence area, we're near the St. Lawrence Market, our new shelter is going to be in a prime spot in downtown Toronto at Adelaide Street and Church Street, right on the corner, right by a church there. And we encountered this new ridiculous notion of a heritage conservation district, where I had to do an appeals to the Heritage Preservation Board. Well, I didn't take it lying down. I didn't take any of their crap. I told them, you need to decide right here and now what side of reconciliation you want to be on, because I have half a mind to buy a full page ad in the Toronto Star and talk about everything wrong with this notion of heritage conservation in Toronto. Our heritage predates your heritage. And if you really want to see architectural heritage in this country, go to Europe, because they got it down really good and it's much older than ours. So they kind of said, okay, Steve, we'll work with you. And they did. We're thankful that wasn't a barrier for us. But I know another example where heritage conservation was used as a new form of NIMBYism to prevent an Indigenous women's shelter from opening up in a neighborhood. It was really ridiculous. And then some of the other barriers is owning versus operating or leasing the property where you have the housing. When you own the property, you can acquire equity. So as if you own it outright, as the value of the land increases, you can go to the bank and borrow off that equity. And that borrowing will enable you to purchase more properties, as we did with our Coxwell one that we bought during the pandemic with our own dime. When you lease it, you don't own the property. You can't leverage that to acquire other properties. But it's still useful, but not really as nice as owning it. So it still gets people off the streets and into housing. This was the housing that we acquired on Homewood Avenue. We acquired this one in 2017. And this is the one we had to compete against any housing providers in Toronto that applied for this RFP process, and we won. And what we did was, it was 2 addresses. We maximized the size of the units, and it used to have 2 stairwells and 2 entrances. So we just cut holes through the brick walls that were common walls. We put in 1 staircase rather than 2. And we maximize the square footage so we can make the units larger. It's 16 units of one bedroom, affordable, deeply affordable housing. We had to go through a committee of adjustment for this, and it was really harmful again. We had 2 consultations with community, and they were both just equally as awful. And this one was completed in 2017, on time and on budget. I could elaborate more on housing. I also want to balance out talking about health, particularly Indigenous perspectives to public health. This is our organizational chart. And it's not the kind where you see in a non-Indigenous organization where it kind of looks like a pyramid and maybe the board of directors are at the top or the executive director. We flipped that pyramid sort of upside down and made a circle out of it. And there's one thing in the middle of this, in the middle of the circle, that you never see in org charts, and that's focus on clients. So the clients are in the middle of this that we work with. I know not every organization that works with people likes referring to the people they serve as clients, but I couldn't think of a better word because we have tenants, we have residents in our shelters, and then we work with people that are outside homeless on the streets. So we have, I'm not going to go through it too much, but we have our street outreach housing services where our vans go out on the streets and engage with people that are staying outside that were homeless. We also have our Sagate program, which is a 22-bed emergency transitional shelter strictly for Indigenous men. We have 5 beds there for Indigenous men leaving federal corrections. They're halfway house beds. We're the only Indigenous halfway house bed provider in all of Ontario, and it's only 5 beds. You hear about the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in corrections, but you never hear about the underrepresentation of Indigenous organizations helping them to reintegrate back in the community. And it's a huge problem. We're doing a study on this. I met with 2 federal ministers for community safety with our idea to expand, and it's gotten us nowhere. Next is our housing. Our houses are our one house in Parkdale is called the Wichita Mishkiki Wigwam. Our second house is Gnu Pune Wakinaban. And that's our 2 houses I showed you. And then we have our men's shelter, which was a 71-bed shelter pre-pandemic. It's now to 54 beds. We serve Indigenous and non-Indigenous men. I'm very proud of the fact that we serve non-Indigenous men because as Indigenous peoples to this land, we've been working with homeless people for well over 500 years. We're really good at it. And then also, we have our Mino-Bimmaadiziwn program, which is an intensive case management program working with Indigenous men that have severe mental health and addictions. It's been around for 12 years. It's funded by, okay, I'm going to skip. Anyways, that's our overview of our programs and services, our wraparound supports to help people remain housed. During the pandemic, we started a COVID response called Doje Mino-Bimmaadiziwn, or the place of healthy breathing. It was a necessity. When COVID hit, Namirez was the second shelter in Toronto to have COVID. And at that time, I had a pandemic plan in place that I had updated, but it wasn't adequate because when we had 2 cases of COVID, we didn't know or have guidance on how to keep our shelters safe. I called City of Toronto's public health staff and no one could give me good advice. I talked to the City of Toronto Shelter Support Housing Administration staff and no one was working at their office. They weren't answering their emails. So I started talking to an Indigenous doctor, Dr. Janet Smiley. And I said, Janet, we navigated COVID. We got through this really well. I imagine as an Indigenous organization experienced this alone by ourselves, what other Indigenous organizations are going through. We happen to have a vacant building that we used to lease to Anishinaabe Health. And I said, it'd be really nice if we could use that space to have a COVID response for our community. It just so happened that she had a grant from Indigenous Services Canada to count Indigenous people in Toronto that had COVID, but she didn't quite know how to do it. So we agreed, let's get a COVID assessment center, a testing center up and running. We can test people. We felt it was imperative to do our own contact tracing because we know our community better than anybody else. It was a public health function and it was their mandate to do the contact tracing. But in Toronto, we knew it took them about an average of 10 days to follow up with a positive case. With us, we could pick and choose who we partnered with. And we partnered with several hospitals in Toronto. We partnered with Women's College Hospital, Sunnybrook Hospital, Mount Sinai Hospital, St. Mike's Hospital, and University Health Network. Mount Sinai Hospital did our testing results. Their lab was the fastest results in town, so we wanted to work with them. Women's College Hospital helped us with our IPAC setup because they were the best experts that we were told to do that. We partnered with Sunnybrook to deliver mass vaccine clinics for Indigenous community. At our little building, the maximum people we could vaccinate in a day when we got around to vaccinations was less than 200. So we knew we need to partner elsewhere. The Indigenous population in Toronto is somewhere around 90,000, according to the Our Health Count study. And we did really well. Now Adoja is shifting to do more of a public health response. We still do COVID testing and vaccines, but we also do, this was a number of vaccinations we did cumulatively as of recently. We did 10,000 doses of COVID vaccinations, and we partnered with a number of organizations. Almost every Indigenous organization in Toronto we partnered with. We didn't see healthcare as a place where people had to come to us to receive it. We thought, no, it'd be more akin to our culture to bring it to the people. Cultural safety was a big factor, and we did it in a culturally safe way. We had a number of Indigenous physicians, nurses, and staff, as well as non-Indigenous to help us that were allied. And we felt that if we deliver health services to other organizations, that will borrow the trust that those staff have built with the clients to trust our staff going in. And once we build that trust, that that they'll come to us eventually. So we're now morphing into a more of a primary healthcare response. And we put in a big proposal to the Ministry of Health, and I'm hoping to hear soon. We put in a multi-million-dollar request. We wanted to hire a number of doctors as well as other types of healthcare practitioners. We also put in our proposal that, and commitment from the University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicine, that we would do placements for their docs that were studying, and so they could get experience working with Indigenous peoples. And we think the ripple effects of that might help healthcare down the road for those perhaps non-Indigenous doctors to have at least that experience and understand how to deliver health in a culturally safe way. So anyways, I'll leave it at that. And I guess I did pretty good.
You did awesome. I always get nominated for these hard jobs. I have to talk about so really thankful that we're able to hear about all of the awesome things that are happening in two amazing cities and in Toronto as well. And the last person that we've asked to come and speak is Gamaminuk Watts. And I couldn't think of a better person to come and speak to this. I've known Gamaminuk for a number of years, and her involvement in helping people in housing has been what I would say really an Anishinaabe perspective or Indigenous perspective. One of the things that mainstream or Western experience and expertise doesn't necessarily recognize that Indigenous community does is that people that have been through specific things are the best people to help other people, right? A lot of times we'll prop up or Western or Eurocentric education, community, society, dominant society props up people that are experts but haven't necessarily been through some of the situations. So it's hard for them to relate. And Indigenous community, and in the way that I was taught, is we lift those people up because those are the people that are able to share with their heart. And so, Gamaminuk Miigwech for coming.
Miigwech. If it's okay, I have to stand. Like, I don't have a this is the PowerPoint. So you know, I don't think you could see my writing.
Yeah, there's no microphone there, but you won't need it. There's,
I don't need no microphone. When I'm teaching, boy, I always tell my students, when you speak like you use your outside voice like somebody's mowing the lawn beside you. And really project your sound, right? So, Bojo, Ani, Sego, Tanse, Gamamonik and Dijnakaz, Wikomakong Dunjaba. I have been living in Gojwanam, Peterborough now for, we did a little bit of math. I'm not very good at math, so apparently it's been 32 years. I was saying 30, but apparently it's 42. So I feel quite honored to be asked to come here, and I've been just listening intently because there's no flat surface. There's one. No, don't worry. Okay, I'll do that. I thought what I would do tonight is share from both a personal and lived experience and professional. And in order to do that, it's something I do when I'm teaching at Fleming, is I do share my story. And that's where a PowerPoint would really come in handy. But anyways, I was someone at the age of 4. I was removed from my biological family. We were living in Toronto, and I was taken by the woman who owned the house. There was a lot of violence and neglect and abuse, and well-intentioned non-Indigenous woman thought it would be better for me if I was removed from that place. And so she did so by doing it around the system. So I was never legally adopted, and there was no guardianship. They literally took me, they changed my name, and they changed my appearance. They moved to the other side of Toronto. So when I was old enough to begin asking some questions, they told me misinformation so that I wouldn't be able to trace where I was from. And so for me, when I think of the term home, I think of this idea of returning home. And I had no idea how I was going to get there, because I didn't even know who I was. I was being raised by well-intentioned people. The woman, by the way, Alice, gave me something that was so important at that primary time, and that was unconditional love. She couldn't have children of her own, and so she loved me as I was her own, even though the way in which they did things wasn't legal and wasn't right, but for all intents and purposes, I know she loved me, and I was at her side when she passed from this world, and I feel fortunate to have been there. What she didn't know, that I was being sexually abused by her partner, and I was told many times that if I told, that I would be put back into worse conditions, and so my silence was something that was for me to protect me. But what I didn't realize, and what probably each of you realize, is that when we hold things in and we don't talk and we don't speak, it builds and it builds and it builds. And so I carried the pain of the shame and the silence with me. And by the time I was 15, I was one angry girl. I was just uncontrollably angry, and I started lashing out. I remember the first time I picked up a cigarette, thinking that was really brave of me to do that. Right? It took me 25 years to beat that habit, but I really thought that for me, for safety, I had to run away from home. And so I ran to the streets of Toronto, where I felt safer than I was in the home that I was being raised. And I was fortunate, I guess, to meet up with people who were, I don't want to call them a gang, because that term really holds a lot of negative connotation. They were a group of people, and they were as well homeless. We were the misfits, that old Christmas movie. We were all misfits, right? We all had our stories, and I was accepted, something I was longing for. I was longing to be accepted and for who I was. And during the period of being 16 till I was 20, in those 4 years, I did a lot of panhandling. I couch surfed. I got menial jobs, got jobs in donut shops, and I think pouring drinks at Wendy's old fashioned hamburgers and stuff. Then I was fortunate enough to find a job with Garfields of Canada, or I thought I was fortunate. And I was one of those people you see in the Toronto subways selling newspapers and chocolate bars and all those things, right? And I did that. And what I liked about that job is that I could be there drunk. It was so easy because I worked a split shift. So I would start in the morning, I'd start drinking in my break, and then I'd come back. And no one knew. And nobody questioned it. I just existed. Until I didn't. There was a gentleman that had come by and he assaulted me in my workplace. And, being assaulted in a public place was traumatic enough, but to realize that it wasn't the actual assault that was so bad, it was the fact that 100 people stood by and watched this man beat me and kick me with steel-toe boots. And it changed me forever, because then my sense of person and trust, and I just wasn't able to go back to work 1 month to the day. And it just happened that year. There was the days matched up. I lost my home in a fire. And so I was homeless again. I was older, and I found myself in a situation where there was nowhere to go. I had no insurance. I had no place to go. The people that had raised me would blame me. They said, "You're stupid not to have gotten yourself insurance." And so I took that in, those words of being again at fault for what was happening, and started drinking. And this time I included drugs, because I was just so much pain and just so confused as to what to do. And then something happened that I have to tell you about, because it was kind of crazy that it even happened. Since I couldn't go back to working at Garfield's, I applied to a temp agency, and they had me going to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, and the deputy minister there was Indigenous. And so, of course, when I started there, I was just answering the phones, right? And he came by, and we had this conversation, and he said, "Oh, you're Nish," and he pulled some cords and strings, and he said, I want to hire you," which, much to his secretary's chagrin, she just disliked me something fierce, but he wanted to give me that opportunity. And that opportunity led to another opportunity at the Ontario Native Affairs Secretariat, where I got a job as a secretary. And I was changing light bulbs and doing crazy things, but it was nothing important, right? Until one day someone said, "Why don't you join us? We're going to Six Nations, where we're in the middle of a land claim negotiation." So I said, "Sure, okay." So we arrived there. This was so exciting for me, like government, and here I had bought myself some new outfit, and I get there, and there was this long table, and we all sat on this side of the table, and then all the representatives from Six Nations and walked into the room, and they sat down, and I realized I'm sitting on the wrong side of the table. It occurred to me that I was on the wrong side, and what was I going to do? So one of the things around that time that was impacting me, And I told you about Alice and how she was able to love me unconditionally. I was still drinking at the time, and a woman named Marie had asked me if I would come to work at a camp, and it was Indigenous kids that were coming to this camp. It was a church camp, but I went, and when I got there, I was just running the canteen, and she said to me that she had had a dream, and she said, I see you as somebody who's going to make big changes in the world. You're going to help build bridges between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people. She said, I don't know what that means or what it's going to look like, but I had this dream. And she gave me this gift of a red pipestone Thunderbird. And she said to me, this is your communicator. This will stay with you when you have to speak from your heart, when you have to share, bring it with you. Ask the Creator for the guidance and the words so that you can do a good job. And I still have that communicator. I've kept it with me in my heart and with me always. I've lost it a few times and it always comes back. And I feel like it's that woman, Marie, you know, she saw me. She looked past the alcohol. She looked past, for some reason, she saw something in me, a gift. And so from there, I got really involved trying to get sober, and I started going to Native organizations. And I went to Council Fire, where I met Jimmy Dick, and I don't know who he is. And I always say that Jimmy was there. He was he was the person that met me on that red road. And I began to learn about my culture. I was going to the Native Women's Resource Center. I was going to the Friendship Center. I was going around the drum. I was learning the ceremonies. I was going to elders gatherings. And for the first time in my life, I realized that there was a yearning inside of me to be a part of something that was so much bigger. And that's when I was fortunate enough to find out that there was a place called Peterborough, Ontario. Had no idea where it was, had no idea. But I found the Native program, and I went and met David Newhouse there, and he was my first teacher, and I got education. And I know my time is running out. There's so much more I could share, but I wanted to tell you, I think, just to wrap up, and what we're hearing here tonight is that there's always little things we can do. We might only be one person, and we might only be saying and seeing something, but when we share that and speak from our heart, it might make the world a difference to one person. And when my spirit name was given to me, the elder told me, you're going to spend your entire life getting bits and pieces from the world, and those bits and pieces will lead you back to home. And I finally feel that I am home. Thank you much.
Speak much. I just want to check in. We're good online? Yeah. So one of the hopes that we were hoping for is to identify some of the intricate and diversity of homelessness, precarious housing, how important home is to Indigenous people, and how it affects our overall health. And also acknowledging that this isn't Indigenous ways of being, Indigenous ways of doing, and Mino-Bimmaadiziwn is not just for Indigenous people. That when something happens, it often finds that we lead the way, whether people realize it or not. But when we're leading the way and talking about Mino-Bimmaadiziwn and all of the pieces to Mino-Bimmaadiziwn, and when people hear it and when people listen and they do something with it, it affects positive change for all people. And that's what's super important. So thank you to all of you for what you've shared, all of the pieces of it, all of the areas and the different corners that you touched on. I have a couple of questions for you, and I'm just gonna go through. I was trying to do my research before tonight and looking at things, and I was looking at the housing strategy that the government came up with, and they identified Indigenous housing as a priority. So a simple one-line statement, Indigenous housing is a priority. And what they're going to do with that priority to prove that it's a priority is to commit to engagement, which is what they did. They committed to engagement. And instead of identifying that the Indigenous engagement or Indigenous consultation, which I find that they're changing consultation to engagement, which means they're just going to try to figure out and listen to people and then go ahead with their own agenda. But I'll digress. My political family. So anyway, what they've done is CMHC had been tasked with doing Indigenous engagement as it relates to Indigenous housing, both First Nation, urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing. So I want to know, everybody here that spoke, Candace, Kevin, Steve, and Gamaminac, to me, you have something really important to share. You have identified what needs to happen. We've heard you. We know what you speak is true. Have you been involved? Did anybody talk to any of you about this engagement or what would happen? Because what has happened is the government has proposed, I think it's $3 million, $4 million over 7 years for an Indigenous strategy, housing strategy, but they're not going to say anything about it until they've engaged. So have you guys been invited to engage on this potential urban, rural, and northern housing strategy? Or have you completed the survey?
Oh my gosh. That's a leading question.
Right? How about we start at that end of the table and come this way?
No.
Perfect.
I am not.
Are you done?
Yes.
No, in Toronto, there's 7 Indigenous housing providers, and not one has been consulted on it. And to make matters worse, this current Liberal government, 3 elections ago, they promised a national housing strategy with the Indigenous housing strategy. And this is what it looks like. A blank piece of paper. I know that they've gone on to engage with a newly formed group that didn't exist a year ago called NICHI, the National Indigenous Collective Housing or something or other. I think it's a bad approach, personally, just simply because a one-size-fits-all for every region across Canada with the diversity of Indigenous peoples across all of those regions is going to fail. It's going to be just as effective as CMHC is for Indigenous peoples currently. In different regions across Canada, we have housing providers that know what the heck they're doing. All they need is the money, right? So in Toronto, our Indigenous housing funder is called Mino-Bimmaadiziwn Development Corporation, and their geography is all of the GTA, as far as Durham region to the outer edge, as far east as I think Halton. So it's a huge area. It encompasses 2 of the largest cities in the province, and they get 25% of the funding through the province's funding, and then the remaining 75% of the funding goes to Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services based at Sault Ste. Marie. So no, there was no consultation. They don't need to consult, just implement the damn Indigenous housing strategy once and for all. They promised it 3 elections ago. How many years has it been? Oh, I'll stop there.
That's Candace.
Okay. So no. for Native People of Sudbury Development Corp. However, there is the COCHI, so that's the Canada Ontario Community Housing Initiative, of which we're receiving funds through the city. And so there's a devolving of that relationship and that responsibility. So that's, I guess, non-engagement. As a group of researchers in the area of Northeastern Ontario, we actually reached out to CMHC with our community partners, which included Native People Sudbury Housing, Swakopmund Friendship Center, as well as the Urban Indigenous Council, the Sacred Circle, to begin conversations towards the development of this Indigenous youth residential transitional shelter. And we had a series of meetings. So it was our initiative, and we did have a series of meetings, but then, which is it, and I'd really love to hear what you have to say about this, because it switched over, the employees switched over, right? So somebody new came in, and they essentially said, these conversations aren't going anywhere because we don't fund, and this was Rapid Housing, we don't fund NGOs anymore. We only fund cities, municipalities. And so I wouldn't worry about it, he said. Just work with your city. So the city and us, obviously we're in a legal dispute, but we've also, as researchers, we've also had disputes around their response to encampments. They shut down encampments, and they do not take a human rights, let alone an Indigenous rights approach to encampments. And so we were on an encampment response committee, and we resigned because they went in and tore it down. And so there's all of these tensions within the city. But anyway, to answer your question, CMHC seems to be involved, but there's no direct engagement, except maybe, just lastly, with this national work, they wanted to be at that table. But that's not an Indigenous research study by any stretch. I think we're fighting for there to be Indigenous voices there. But so anyway, so that's the level of not much. Yeah.
Candace?
Yeah, so I'm with Kevin here on the Native People Sudbury Development Corporation. The only thing that I can remember that was even close to that was like a couple years ago, we had like meetings with CMHC, but that was before this whole policy got implemented. And it was like a get together of all the different housing providers. But nothing much has happened since that meeting, even though they brought up the ideas that the housing is an issue and how the providers need more funding and how the transitional homes need more housing and how the hospitals are being overburdened because there's just generally people who are homeless who have nowhere else to go, but they end up either in jail or in hospitals just for safety because it's trying to fight the elements. So they've known that this is a problem for a long time, but I don't know where it's going because it doesn't seem to be what they're saying it is right now.
Thank you. So that was kind of a self-serving question because I am a little bit political. But I did want to pull kind of back to the health. I want to pull back around to how important homes are to our overall health as humans and as Anishinaabe people. And I'm going to share very quickly that when I left home, a small town in southwestern Ontario, after coming from the States, from Detroit, and living precariously there as a little girl, one of the things that happened is I took off and went to Toronto. I went to a friend's couch. I was able to scrape together a little bit of money. I probably could have called home, but I was too proud to do that. They told me not to leave. They told me about those Toronto Indians and that lateral violence in community and how that is. And so I said, all right, you don't want me to go to Toronto, I'm going to Toronto. And I sat on a couch. And then when I was able to scrape up enough money for first and last, my first bachelor at on Ontario and Gerrard. If anybody knows, I could see gardens. I slept on the floor of that bachelor apartment for 6 months because I didn't have anything. And it was Anishinaabe Homes in Toronto that gave me my first chance. And when I got my proverbial crap together, I applied for a job. I applied for, I think it was the Ray program. Bob Ray, was it back then? Or one of those governments that gave people a shot. A Native child gave me that shot because they applied through that program, and I started working at Mukayam, which was day sexual abuse treatment, and I started doing my own healing and my own work. So for me, housing was a really big part of. I was really proud of that floor that I slept on at the corner of Gerrard and Ontario Street in Toronto, because I could feed myself even if it was going to food banks. And I got my start. And look where we are now. Look what we're doing now. So for me, that's a really good, feel-good story. It talks about our resilience. It talks about our perseverance. It talks about our pride as Anishinaabe people. So I would ask you to share a feel-good story, whether it's your own or that of someone that you helped, that of someone that helped you. When it was Francis Anderson, Anishinaabe Homes in Toronto, that basically said, here's a furnished room. You're worth it. Get off that floor in Ontario and Gerrard. Candace?
Sure. So I have a fairly recent story of help in getting something that we want through help of community. So a couple years back, I was at Laurentian, woot woot, and I was working on my undergrad degree and applying to medical school. But what they don't tell you is that you need references from so many people. You need a community member, you need a teacher, you need other references like professional and personal references, as well as verifiers for everything that you're going to state for your whole med school application. So I had to go around and, like, as an Indigenous person, to ask for help is gut-wrenching. Because you're constantly told that you're less than or you're not worthy. So basically you're begging everybody to be seen as worthy. So I went around and asked everybody, and I got these amazing reference letters. And then I ended up getting into medical school. And that's not even the highlight part. When I was doing, I know it's pretty cool, but the highlight part was when I got my schedule for my clinical rotations. This week, actually, I'm starting neurosurgery, like my rotation in the hospital. And I can't help but remember, I used to clean floors. I used to be so hungry and have not money that when I was working in the service industry as a hotel maid, I would eat some of the food off of the trays because that's all I had. To know that with help from community members and a hell of a lot of effort, we can, like, build each other up to put ourselves in positions where we can not only help ourselves, but be in positions to help others too. I think that's one of the really strong points of our community, is that we're willing to come together when we need help. We're willing to help each other achieve our goals. And I thought that was amazing for me to know where I was and where I'm going was huge for me. And I know it was thanks to all the people who have supported me along this journey. That's my story.
Evan.
Miigwech, Candace, that's an amazing story. I think I actually don't know where to begin. And the reason I say that is I feel like I've been helped my whole life, you know, and particularly here at Trent, in Peterborough. And as a non-Indigenous person working in Indigenous studies and working closely with Indigenous people and community members, my partner recently asked, or we were having this conversation, and my partner said, "Isn't it strange that you've been doing this work for so long, even before there was a word for it, like ally, you know?" And she said, "I know why. I know why." And I said, "So why?" And she said, "So what do you think?" You know, and she said, "Well, because they gave you the family you didn't have." You know, and she's right. And it's been that way for 30 years, 40 years, you know. And I'm here back in Peterborough, and it's interesting. I didn't say this at the beginning, but I lost my job at Laurentian because Laurentian went through an insolvency, right? So the university senior admin made terrible decisions, and so many people suffered. The community as a whole suffered, and but I was able to come back here, back home, you know, back home to Mino-Bimmaadiziwn and work at Trent again, where I started. And that's because of being part of this larger extended family and all that that means. So I'm incredibly grateful. And the other, just the last thing to say about that is being part of this family and community has shown me how to be part of a family and community, which I didn't know before. And essentially what that means is to help people, right? As you are helped. And that's been the nature of the work and the nature of my life as a dad, as a community member, as just a human being. And so that's my good news story. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Steve?
Well, I was struggling to come up with examples because I have quite a few. When I thought, in keeping with the theme of tonight around health, was you know, when Adoje Mino-Bimmaadiziwn, and we eventually got the opportunity to offer vaccines to community members, you know, we recognized we couldn't do a whole bunch of vaccines out of our place in a sustainable level. So I reached out to a professor I know at U of T. I said, "Hey, who can I talk to at the Faculty of Medicine or someone at U of T? I want to see if we can use Varsity Stadium to do a vaccine clinic, a mass one." And they put me in touch with somebody. And I guess he was a dean of medicine there, and said, "Steve, yeah, come on over. Happy to meet you. I'll show you around. If you want Varsity Stadium, we'll give it to you if you want. No problem. We even help. And but I'd like you to see our space. We have a COVID vaccine clinic that's underutilized, and we think it's great." And so I asked one of the doctors from Women's College Hospital, who's a infection prevention and control specialist, to come with me, and she didn't even say no. And she came along, and I went to their student exam center, which was set up for a COVID vaccine space, and it was perfect. It was beautifully set up. I've never seen such a good setup in terms of infection prevention and control. They had the pharmacy department there, and they also offered nurses from the Faculty of Nursing. Through COVID, when we set up with Adoje Mino-Bimmaadiziwn, when we needed help, I wasn't afraid to ask, even though I didn't know them. And no one ever said no. No one ever. And I've never really experienced that before. And it was really incredible. I wish it could be like that all the time, but it was really inspiring. And it really helped our community a lot. And it helped forge those really good relationships with those institutions and faculties. And we still have connection with them. And sometimes when we're hiring, we'll ask, "Hey, any Indigenous students that recently graduated that you might want to, you know, introduce us to?" And that's how we've been able to sometimes hire either Indigenous nurses or we get word about Indigenous doctors. So, yeah.
So I never got around to telling you. But I actually have been, I was a housing provider for Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services for 10 years. And in that capacity, I too have lots of examples of because for me, working there, it was an opportunity to give back and to help others who were experiencing homelessness and other issues. And so when I was sitting here too thinking, which experience, and there was one that stood out to me. For me, it's always been a difficult challenge for me to stay within the lines. I don't know why, but I just don't know what that word no means. And I go around if I need to do something. And I was often told that I wasn't a social worker, that I was a housing provider, and it was important that I do my job. But whenever there was a situation, a woman had 3 kids, and she was living in a different housing portfolio, and she had applied to native housing. So at that time, the process was that I gotta take my pills. Oh my gosh, it's gonna wake me up tonight. About this. So the process was that I would go out and I would sit with them and talk to them and find out, their circumstance. And so she had explained to me that the housing that she was living in, the landlord was actually not fixing the issues, and that there was mold in her house and her kids were getting sick, and she had asked me if I could get her out of that housing. But because she was already in rent geared to income housing, the policy was that I could not offer because she was already benefiting. So because I had worked also for the city of Peterborough, I did a few phone calls and wanted to find out about this landlord and what on earth was going on. And so I found out that she had been fined quite a few times with infractions in housing, that she wasn't doing the work, wasn't completing it. And so that for me built the case that I could bring and say, we've got to give this woman housing. We got to get her out of that situation and put her in our housing. And I won, and we got her into our housing. And I went to see her because we do an annual inspection. And I went back to her house, and oh my God, I said to her, like, this should be in the Better Homes and Gardens catalog. Like, it was gorgeous. Like she said to me, and it really touched my heart. She said, thank you for listening, and thank you for believing what I was saying to you and taking that extra step to figure it out what was happening. Because of you, now I'm living in safe, affordable housing. And that always stayed with me.
So we've come to the end of the evening, and I pride myself in almost being on time, whether it's a meeting I'm chairing or an event or anything like that, but also making space for what needs to be said. So I'm going to take my privilege as facilitating and moderating tonight, and before I ask our elder to end in a good way, is to remind everyone, as I often do, that these are heavy subjects. These are hard subjects. And whether they affect you immediately or a week from now or an hour from now or a year from now, they will affect you in some way, whether you recognize it or not. So it's super important to take care of yourselves. Super important to look at your life like a turtle. I'm turtle clean, best clean ever. You look around at your whole self, and you make sure that you take care of yourself. Make sure you thank the people that are around you that make it possible for you to be here, for you to hear these words, and think about the people that aren't here and how you can spread those words to them. So, Chimiquetch, and I'd ask Lorenzo to come up and close for us in a good way.
Well, I'm not going to do it like George Jones. My name is Chimiquetch. And that means big oak tree. And I'm to behave that way. I am to take you in, give shelter. I'm there to provide shade and rest, food. It's all there. An oak tree. That's my name, and that's what I have to live up to, live like. And I'm telling you this now because I didn't earlier. So I also would like to tell you that I've been homeless, and it's only on the back of settler people that I've been able to get a place to live. I had the income, I had the education. I couldn't get housing on reserve because of politics there. When I was going to college in Toronto, this guy and I were looking for a place. We couldn't find one. So I said, you go along tomorrow. And he said, why? And I said, because you'll get a place. You'll get a place without me. He said, no, that's not the way people are. And he went and he got a house that day. And then I had the same experience with my wife. No one would rent to us because I was an Indian. And so I sent her alone. And she got us a place. But we were the first ones on our community to get a Section 10 house. Section 10 is the bank holds the mortgage for you. And you pay the bank. We've burned our mortgage. It's gone. We own the house now. Kids are leaving. It's too big a house. But my experience with health in this way has shown me that the type of house you live in affects your health. The type of dwelling that you reside in will affect your health just as much as being homeless. Because it traps you in a wage bracket or financial bracket that is very hard to get out of. Our house when I was a little boy was a 2-room house, and there was 15 of us living in there. And when you'd lay in your bed at morning this time of year, you could see the frost on the nails. And you'd look up there. You wouldn't want to get out of bed. But someone had to make the fire. And that was my father. And he showed me that you take care of things, things will take care of you. And so it's come to pass. I thank you all for being here tonight. And I thank our panelists for the sharing that they've done with us. That has been so personal, at times so intimate, and yet so knowledgeable at the same time. Miigwech. And I miigwech each one of you here because you bring to life what they are talking about. You support what they're talking about and presenting. Bonjour, j'aime le Chimitek Mishmi, Miigwech and the kid. We don't question. Thank you for helping us do what we had to do here tonight, Creator. And I pray, Creator, for the safe deliverance of everyone here to their homes tonight. It would seem to me that everyone in this room has a home to go to, call their home. And for that, I am thankful. I am thankful, Creator, for the words that came out of our panelists tonight. I'm sure they were guided by your gentle hands. And I appreciate, Creator, the opportunity to stand here and give thanks for all that we have tonight. Miigwech, 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 miigwech.
And go home. Yes, I can take them. I do have a couple of, yes, for your important. And then. Let me take my, thank you, Candace.
Okay, yeah, okay, thanks.